Hey, everybody, and welcome to Spero Day's YouTube channel. I just wanted to let you know that we have a wonderful guest speaker today. I'm not there today at Spero Day or even online because as you watch this, I am out west skiing with my 25-year-old daughter. My daughter, Sophie, lives and works in New York City, and we are meeting out in Colorado and spending this wonderful father-daughter time together skiing. And it's just an amazing thing. I'm just so proud of this kid, and I just enjoy my kids, both my kids as adults. So this is a neat time for me. But you are really in for a treat because today's guest speaker, well, first, she is one of my good friends. This is somebody I really admire, I trust. Her name is Keri Ladouceur. Keri is a very accomplished minister and pastor. She has served on the staff of some of the largest churches in the country, but she also went through her own faith shift. And she is now the executive director of the Post Evangelical Collective. Keri is literally one of the leading voices in this whole Christian spiritual shift that we are seeing in America and in the West. And I'm proud to know her. I'm proud that she's my good friend, but she is a gifted person and an important voice. And today she's really going to take a look at when we go through hurts and suffering, where can we experience our spiritual life and where can we experience our attunement to God, in God's presence in that. And so she really breaks down some old rigid views of that and awakens us all to a view that includes our mind, our body, and our spiritual lives. So you are in for a treat. So welcome, Keri Ladouceur.
I am so grateful to get to be a part of this church and what's happening at Spero Day. The goodness that you are bringing into the world is making a remarkable difference. David mentioned that I serve as the executive director of an organization called the Post Evangelical Collective. Before that, I served as a pastor at a church in the Chicagoland area. And one of my favorite stories there is a guy named Robbie came up to me one time after church service and said, Keri, I was at work. I'm sorry I'm late for this, sort of leader huddle that we're having here. I told my colleagues that I had a meeting with Pastor Ludacris that I had to run to. And if you're not familiar with Ludacris, Ludacris is a rapper. And I will not rap for you today, but I did rap my speech in the 5th grade to become student body president. And I felt so seen in that moment. And I'll likely share some more words that rhyme through poetry with you. But I come to you as sort of a fellow journeyer on the path of spiritual evolution. I sort of found my way back to God as a young adult after trying everything that the world had to offer me that was going to make me feel full or fulfilled or whole. I had a stint in the marketplace working in the business industry, scaling a franchise, made great money, partied, kind of lived it up, and still, I would say, turned up empty at the end of the day. And I darkened the doors of a Southern Baptist church on an Easter Sunday, wondering if perhaps that was part of what I was missing in my life. And I would say even today had a sort of a transcendent experience there nearly 20 years ago that altered the trajectory of my life. I walked away from that experience really wrestling with the words of Jesus. That I had this passage on my bathroom mirror that was from Mark 8. It says, if you want to find your life, you have to be willing to lose it. And if you lose your life in Christ, then you'll find your life. And I really wrestled with, what does this mean for my business that I'm running? What does this mean for how I manage my money? What does it mean for how we treat people at work? What does it mean for my relationships and my habits? And it began a journey for me of following Jesus. This was a conservative evangelical church. And just a couple months in, I was sort sort of handed a script for what my life was supposed to look like. I married an evangelical pastor there. He dreamed of going to seminary, and as we explored different opportunities there, we ended up at a church in Chicagoland that was a pretty progressive evangelical church, and in so many ways was quite expansive for me. I got to experience, women teaching and serving side by side with men. I got to have an expansive imagination for the gospel beyond just compassion initiatives, but what does it actually look like to engage justice work, to want equitable systems and structures, and what's the gospel implication for that? I got to explore the implications of evangelical eschatology in Israel Palestine and real live conflict zones, and what are the implications of the way of Jesus that I had been handed? What might be the implications of the way of Jesus here? I experienced expansive spiritual evolution in that sort of progressive evangelical space, and I walked through my own shattering experience there when I spoke up about inequities and injustice in the ways that power was being used that were antithetical to what we said we believed. I thought this would be welcomed, that I would be a friendly, that we would reimagine mutuality. I had no idea that I would just be obliterated by the organization. And I wrestled through this faith shattering of, wait, what we say over here is not how we're behaving. And this gap between what we said we believed and what we did was really difficult for me to manage. My own sort of deconstruction experience, if you will. And I recognize for some people, a deconstruction is sort of a slow unraveling, maybe one or two threads of how you imagine the world, how you experience the world get pulled, and the whole thing slowly begins to unravel. Perhaps like you, or like me, you too had more of a shattering experience, and at the end of this experience, I had more questions than I did answers. At first, I couldn't even speak the things of God anymore. Spiritual disciplines were not a part of my life, but as I was engaging in sort of healing work, emotional and mental health work, and engaging the trauma that I had experienced in this church, that if I'm honest with you, opened up all sorts of trauma from my childhood that had not been tended to. I kept discovering sort of fingerprints of the divine. I got to a point between, sort of synchronicities that I was experiencing in the world and what I was learning about neuroplasticity and discovering the divine sort of in my body at the cellular level. I was really compelled with a new imagination for the things of God. I went from only being able to say, I don't know, the algorithm of the universe. That was how I could reference God. But my sense of sort of this divine leading continued to grow. I have a pastor friend who talks about God as the loving mystery that holds it all together. And in this spiritual evolution, one of the things that I discovered is just how much of my life was held together by this previous paradigm, one that I would say unintentionally handed me sort of a spiritual prosperity gospel. It was this idea that if you are faithful, it was sort of built around certainty. If you do this and this and this, then it will go well with you, or you will experience the blessed life. And I think what unintentionally happens there is that all of a sudden when disaster strikes, when disease or diagnosis hits, when death is around us, when we're experiencing divorce, when all of a sudden things don't go according to plan, it can feel as if we caused it, right? But I did all the things. I was faithful. I was obedient. I did the things. And it can unintentionally suggest that we cause the difficulty that we experience. What I found, frankly, is that the spiritual prosperity gospel didn't really hold up for me when real life hit. And I've been on a journey of discovering then, how do I answer questions like, where is God in suffering? In this moment, I know so many people personally and pastorally that are really wrestling with this question, where is God in suffering? Where is God in the last 18 months in the Middle East as we have watched atrocities play out? Where is God as we're seeing the fires in LA with tens of thousands of people being displaced, billions of dollars in damage, people who have lost everything? I found myself in the midst of these headlines being just shocked at the sort of conspiracy theories that I was reading on all sides of this. I went down several of the rabbit holes of people trying to make sense of what was happening in the world. I watched people in a former faith paradigm that shaped me, that I once ascribed to, suggests that these atrocities were caused or inflicted by God, that people had done something to deserve them, or that God was in some way using loss and devastation as a way to inflict God's will on the world. And I just have to confess to you, I no longer worship a God like that. I don't ascribe to a God that would utilize death-dealing systems to inflict God's will on the world, but this certainly leaves me wrestling with the same questions. Where is God in the midst of suffering? And if I'm honest with you, I think my own sort of propensity to grab onto the headlines and the conspiracy theories and the scientific data that would suggest what we're doing in the Middle East with carbon emissions is impacting what's happening in climate change and in LA and all the scientific ways, all the ways I wanted to try to make sense of it. I was engaging those mostly to avoid the pain and the grief that those realities brought up. The reality that 20 years ago, I lost everything I owned in a house fire, and that there are still times today that I go looking for pictures or documents that I no longer have. The sheer devastation, the pain of what has happened to our family in LA. I was avoiding my own pain and grief and presence to the suffering of others because of the discomfort of it. And I'm thinking more these days about where is God in suffering, and what I'm finding in my own story, what I'm finding in the story unfolding around us is that where God is in suffering is that God is present. God is present in suffering. God is present in my own discomfort and suffering. God is present in the suffering of others. In my own story, when I couldn't speak the words of God, but continued to experience God around me, I decided to, of all things, go to seminary to work out my own salvation with fear and trembling. I was still so compelled by the person and the life and the teachings of Jesus. I just couldn't reconcile what I had experienced in my church setting, where we fundamentally didn't behave how we believed, but this winsome invitation to resurrection life, to kingdom life. And as I began to sort of sift through trying to reconcile these things, I came across this passage. The psalmist tells us that God is near to the brokenhearted. The Message interpretation translation of this says, when you have been kicked in the gut, God is there. And of all the things that resonate with me today, this is the reality. God is present in suffering. God is with the brokenhearted. God wants to be present with us in our own suffering and through us with the suffering of the world. God is present through initiatives like the Parent Circle in Israel, Palestine, where Rabbi and Bassam, both who have lost children in the conflict, are saying no more violence, no more retribution, no more reactivity to the pain and the wounds that this conflict has caused us. They're creating spaces where parents on all sides of the conflict can come together and enter into the pain and the loss and devastation of one another. They're reimagining what it looks like to pursue peace together. These are the places I'm finding in the world today that God is present. My son asked me just this week, Mom, can you remember what January of 2020 was like? And then he asked me, do you think that January of 2020 or January of 2025 is better? You know, he's sort of working through how to put the pieces of the world together in his own mind. And I thought about January of 2020. Do you remember January of 2020? For me, I thought about how I was on a plane heading to South Africa to meet with post apartheid reconciliation peacemakers. I got to sit in the home of Albie Sachs, one of the first people that Nelson Mandela elected to be a part of what does it look like to rebuild post apartheid South Africa. My imagination in the circles I found myself in these conversations with pastors and other peacemakers that were reimagining the world, so much was opening up for me, and I had no idea what would happen just 2 months later as the world fundamentally changed through COVID. I was thinking about January 2025, and just in the first 2 weeks, we saw a year's worth of activity and trying to reconcile from us. And I'm not sure that we can quite answer that question, right? January 2020 to January 2025, which is worse or better? But it is an entirely different world that we're living in just 5 years later. Can you remember what life was like, what your world was like in a pre-COVID era? I was reading recently that 70 to 80% of Americans are functioning right now in something called allostatic load, or in something called adrenal fatigue. Sorry, 70 to 80% of Americans are functioning in adrenal fatigue, which is this idea that we have hit something called allostatic load. It's like we've been taking in and taking in and taking in stressors and disruptors and, good God, unprecedented times. And we have hit this limit, this allostatic load limit, which means 70 to 80% of Americans are living in fight or flight, where our nervous system just automatically is functioning in fight or flight, or I'd add two more: fight or flight, or fawn or freeze, right? This response when our system is literally overwhelmed and overloaded, and we cannot even be present to what's in front of us. I think about the implications of the sort of collective nervous system right now being at allostatic load, and the reactivity then that reverberates from our bodies when we're unable to take anything else, and when we're actually unable to be present to our own lives and to the world around us. For many of us, that means there are adaptive patterns that we have sort of taken on. Perhaps you were handed these adaptive patterns from your family of origin, or maybe there's ways that that previous faith paradigm that was run on fear and shame and behavior modification are still sort of operating inside of you. Pete Scazzero says you could have Jesus in your heart, but you still have grandpa in your bones. Right? These systems can still be active inside of us. My daughter said to me recently, Mom, I realize that I'm not really feeling my feelings very much right now. I'm just intellectualizing them. First of all, who is this kid? Because I want to be her when I grow up, but I can resonate with that, just intellectualizing my feelings instead of feeling them. Or maybe you came from a system that taught women or men to be codependent, to need to manage the emotions of others. And so perhaps that's how you avoid your own pain or discomfort, or the discomfort of the world, is just by managing the feelings of the people around you. Or maybe for you, it's about overperforming or overproduction. I know for me, overfunctioning was a trauma response that allowed me to avoid pain and discomfort, and it worked until it didn't. In allostatic load, in this sort of place of fight or flight, freeze or fawn, many of us get really close to the point of getting triggered, right? You know what a trigger is. For me, it feels like when the Hulk is just going to come out of me. And usually I find in those moments when I get triggered, it very rarely has to do with the sort of situation or stimulus in front of me, right? I did some work in my trauma healing journey with an organization called Onsite, and they have this saying, when it's hysterical, it's historical. That triggery sort of Hulk feeling, when it comes out and it doesn't match the situation in front of us, chances are good there's something historical playing out right now. I didn't like the way that the word historical can sometimes be used to diminish or invalidate emotional experiences of women. And so I added to the phrase a little bit. I also say when it's hostile, it's historical, because that tends to be how I experience the men in my life who get triggered. When it's hysterical, when it's hostile, there's something historical coming up in the moment that's longing to be tended to. And every time this happens for us, family, it's an invitation to get reflective about the pain or discomfort, about the memory or the wound or the story that's playing out, or we can double down on avoidance of these things, right? Uh, for me, I sometimes want to just blame the situation that's in front of me that has nothing to do with the pain or the suffering or the discomfort that's coming up. When we are people that can be attentive to our own triggers, to our own wounds, to our own discomfort or pain or suffering, I'm convinced these days that expands our capacity to be present to the pain, to the discomfort, to the suffering of those around us. When I ask that question, where is God in suffering? The answer I come back to again and again and again is God is present. God's present with the suffering of those in the Middle East right now, even in the midst of a ceasefire, who are struggling to pick up the pieces and reimagine what does life on the other side of such horrendous loss look like. Not just ceasefire and stopping killing one another. What does mutuality in the spaces that we inhabit look like? On Monday, we hear the visions of reflections on the visions of two very different men in our world, right? Two men that have very different visions for what our world would look like. One that runs on a rhetoric of fear and shame, of othering and dehumanizing and making enemies of people, and an entirely different vision that runs on an entirely different energy that's rooted in belovedness, that asks the question, what is an equitable world for all people that honors the belovedness, the humanity of all look like? And I think somewhere in there, oddly, there's an invitation for us to reflect on what is the energy that I'm running on? What is the imagination I have for how God is present in the midst of the suffering of the world and how God is present in the midst of my own suffering? What I'm finding is when I tend to those places of pain and my own story, those wounds, rather than become poison that get just reactivated and reverberate out into the world and further inflict harm on the people in front of me, whether that's emotional reaction, whether that's shame or blame or vitriol that comes up. When I live from a place of not tending to that woundedness, those wounds become poison to the world around me. But when I live with this amount of presence to my pain, when I live with attentiveness to those wounds, when I sit and ask the question, where is God present in my pain? And what is the invitation? What's the wisdom of this wound? When I get triggered, that's my body's response and my body's way of protecting me from something it imagines is a threat. When I'm attentive to that pain, when I'm attentive to those wounds, wisdom can actually come from those wounds and they begin to unleash medicine in the world around me. I'm imagining, what does a faith paradigm look like that doesn't need to look past or spiritually bypass the pain in the world, the pain within me, the pain of others? What does a faith paradigm look like that actually enters into the pain and suffering of my own story, of my brothers and sisters, of my neighbors, of my enemies, the suffering of others around the world? What is a faith paradigm that actually wants to extend belonging, expansive belonging to people who don't even hold the same belief system that I do? What does it look like in this moment? As my friend, or as a psychologist, Francis Weller talks about this sort of collective dark night of the soul. And he says, one that likely needs to happen. The systems and structures of supremacy and patriarchy and racism, they need to crumble, but it's a dark night of the soul to walk through the crumbling of the systems and structures around us. And he says, what does it look like for us to become islands of safety where life endures? These are the things that I'm wondering about. What does it look like for me to be an island of safety for the people of pain in my life? Because what I'm learning is that the extent to which I can show up to the pain or discomfort of other people is directly linked to the extent to which I can show up to my own pain. And If I can't look at my own pain, I don't want to look at yours. But when I can show up in presence to my own pain, when I can attend to the divine spirit present with me in that, I'm able to actually extend that to be the hands and feet, the body of Christ in the world, extending presence in suffering. What would it look like for us to be islands of safety where life can endure? To bring our whole full selves to belong to one another and extend this expansive belonging to one another, rooted in belovedness, rooted in your belovedness, rooted in this idea that each and every human I interact with bears a unique and distinct image of God, that my understanding and comprehension of the divine is incomplete without the unique, distinct image of God that you bring. A faith paradigm that would suggest you don't need to cut off parts of who you are to belong here. A place that you could actually belong to yourself and remember those parts that you have lobbed off for the sake of belonging in an old faith paradigm, where you get to belong to yourself, to the divine, to one another, to your enemy, to the world, to creation itself that Christ is actively redeeming and restoring. What would it look like in a post-evangelical faith paradigm for us to be these places of belonging, rooted in belovedness, such that we could become redemptive presence in the world? I don't want to pretend to have answers for you. I don't want to even cling to the idea that answers and certainty and control can give us, but I want to bless the questions. Where is God in our suffering? God is as close as we are to the suffering inside of us and in those around us. What does it look like for us to become islands of safety where life can endure, real, true, gritty aspects of life? What does it look like to imagine that we belong to one another, to belong to ourselves, to one another, to all of creation, celebrating the belovedness of all of humanity and working towards becoming redemptive presence in the world, faith spaces of mutuality and flourishing? Friends, it's a delight to get to be on this journey with you. Where is God in the midst of suffering? Here's one of the only things that I know: God is present. Present in the fear of what lies ahead of us. Present in the painful realities that are playing out, consequences of inequities and injustices that we get to show up in the midst of, that we get to show up not wounded, not with that same energy of fear or retributive imaginations for justice, but we get to show up as redemptive presence, belonging to ourselves, belonging to one another. I want to extend to you a blessing for the questions on the journey. It's a poem written by Jan Richardson called Blessing the Questions. Let them come, the questions that storm through the crack in the world. Let them come, the questions that crawl through the hole in your heart. Let them come, the questions in anguish, the questions in tears. Let them come, the questions in rage, the questions in fear. Let them come, the questions that whisper themselves so slow. The questions that arrive with breathtaking speed. The questions that never entirely leave. The questions that bring more questions still. Let them come, the questions that haunt you at shadowy hours, the questions that visit in deepest night, the questions that draw you into rest, into dream, the questions that stir the wakening world. May you experience God present today in your pain, in your discomfort, in your delight, in your joys, as you are leaning into those moments of trigger, to those places of woundedness. May you find glimmers of hope and goodness. May you find that as your attentiveness to the pain grows, your attentiveness to the beauty and delight and desire of our good God for the flourishing of you and of all of humanity. May you find God in the questions.
Well, I hope you enjoyed Keri Ladouceur. And my guess is if you've made it through that all the way to me, then Keri said some things that really connected to you, that resonated with you, and that are meaningful to you. I mentioned that Keri is the executive director of the Post Evangelical Collective. And what that organization is, it is a gathering of ministers, reverends, pastors, artists, um, influencers, the curious, who have been drawn to this shift that is happening in the United States, in the West, with Christian spirituality, that have moved a whole bunch of us beyond our rigid, conservative, Protestant evangelicalism. We just think there's a God beyond that. And Keri is the executive director of this organization, which is in the winds of this movement. And each year they hold an annual conference. For the past couple of years they have. And this year it is at our church, Spero Day in Nashville. So if you would like to join, or you're curious about this whole shift that is happening and hear leading voices that are talking about it and experiencing it, then join us in Nashville at the end of April. It is on April 29th. That's a Tuesday, all the way through Wednesday, April 30th. Join us in Nashville, and it's only going to cost you a little more than $100. That's how much the conference is. So if you're interested in joining others of us who are part of this, or you're just curious about it, go to the postevangelicalcollective.com. You can just Google search that, and you can register right there. Now, next week, when I'm done skiing, I will be right here online, and I will be giving installment number 2 of my series called Light of a New Year, just starting out the year and looking ahead to 2025 and how we can spiritually attune. And next week, I'll be talking about that we are just wired for new horizons. We are wired for that. Of course, we have to move through the vulnerable risks of moving towards that, letting go of some things. But that's what I'll be talking about next week. So I hope to see you then. Peace, everybody.